Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. My guest on the podcast today is Rowena Hill. Rowena is a professor in the psychology department at Nottingham Trent University. She's a professor of resilience, emergencies and disaster science. She has worked with the fire service community for the last 22 years, focusing on wellbeing, resilience and risk. In the last 3 years, she has been leading the NFCC Health and Wellbeing Project, as well as a great deal of work with the Firefighters Charity, developing guidance on suicide prevention. She's worked with the NFCC to establish the first national group of fire-focused academics to support the fire community in the use of science and knowledge, the Academic Collaboration, Evaluation and Research Board. Her huge passion and interest in this comes from her father, who was actually a firefighter for 35 years. She also recently received her MBE for public service in recognition of her research and policy work with the emergency services and civil contingency structures. She is the honorary research lead for the Firefighters Charity, a trustee for the Workforce Development Trust, a member of the Academic Reference Group for the HMICFRS, and works with the National Police Chiefs Council, and was a policy fellow seconded into government for 18 months to work on preparing for the risks for our changing climate. In this conversation today, myself and Rowena discuss the intricacies of psychology, particularly in relation to mental health and suicide prevention. We explore the interesting role of clinical psychologists, the importance of psychological safety in workplaces, and the evolving understanding of mental health issues. Rowena shares loads of great insights from her research on suicide in the fire services, emphasising the need for compassionate support and effective communication. Our discussion really delicately touches on the significance of social support and the challenges of addressing mental health in various contexts. We discuss the critical importance of health and wellbeing support within the fire and rescue service, especially during times of crisis. We explore the need for a culture of care, the significance of peer support, and the recognition of signs of distress among our colleagues. Our discussion goes deeper and also highlights the integration of academic knowledge into practice and the role of civil contingencies in community resilience. Overall, our conversation emphasises the interconnectedness of personal wellbeing, organisational culture, and community engagement in fostering a supportive environment for first responders. It was an absolute pleasure to have Rowena on the podcast. I'm really excited to have her on again, and potentially some of her colleagues as well, as we delve into the academic side and what this can bring to the clarity and solutions within the first responder community. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Rowena Hill MBE. I'll see you on the other side. So we first met at the AFSA Winter Conference, and you gave a very emotive and insightful talk. And I actually met Dr. Carver when he was there as well, and he gave a talk on change. Another fantastic episode. And I always love bringing academics on the podcast because I've said it before, but I'll say it ad nauseum. You help us connect the dots through some academic rigor around what we kind of feel is happening anyway, and like we have this visceral feel that something isn't right or something isn't being heard, and then you bring a lot of that academic reinforcement to some of the concerns that we have, and some of the work you've been doing with the Firefighters Charity, and we'll put some links in the bottom here for people to go and look at some of the research. But first, if you could take us back to why you got started in the world of psychology, effectively.
Yeah. The world of psychology. That sounds like a really exciting place to be for me. The world of psychology. It sounds like a distant planet. It's not though. I think
it's the world of the mind though, isn't it?
So psychology is everywhere that people are.
That's it. And people are everywhere. So if you can master people and master yourself, then you're laughing.
Absolutely. And I think for me, when I had quite what would the word be? Influential event, I think, that happened earlier on in my life that got me interested into why people react in different ways to different things. And I remember my mum tells a story that that I was interested when I was about 8 years old. So that always grew, and I was always very keen to understand people, to understand how life impacted on people, and some people seem to handle that in one way and another in another way, and that isn't to say that there's any good or bad difference between those two, but that always held my attention, I think, despite all the distractions when you're growing up and temptations to go in different paths. Psychology was always there in the background. So when I finished my undergraduate, I then did a master's, and then I actually wanted to be a clinical psychologist, and then accidentally fell into academia. I didn't mean to at all. I took a job trying to save for a mortgage while my training course started, because I'd got onto a clinical psychologist training course, and then fell in love with research, fell in love with teaching, fell in love with exactly kind of as you outline there. It's how we can help sectors and different organisations be the best that they can be for everybody to have good knowledge and access to good knowledge. And that's, I think, then consistently driven everything that I've done.
I've got a few questions I want to ask off the back of that. And just so we have the full context of it, what does a clinical psychologist do then, just by difference? This episode is brought to you in partnership with Godiva Limited. Godiva is one of the world's leading providers of specialist equipment for emergency services market. Renowned for innovation, quality and reliability, Godiva produces a comprehensive range of fire pumps, including vehicle-mounted, portable, and their cutting-edge integrated total water flow control system, SAMFlows. I've been using Godiva my entire career as a reliable pump on the fire ground. It is such a crucial element of a successful firefighting team that you want to empower your crews with the very best, reliable, quality product. Reach out to our partners by checking the notes in the podcast. Now back to the show.
So clinical psychologists mostly either work in therapeutic or hospital settings, and what they'll effectively do is they'll have a group of people that they're working with, because it's in the NHS, we tend to refer to them as patients, but they will be working in specific areas. So a little bit like a surgeon specialism, or a GP might specialise in something. Clinical psychologists might work with disordered eating, or they might work with older adults who have been through some form of traumatic experience, or and essentially what they're doing is they're assessing that individual, looking to see what their needs are, building a plan around them to try and help them process and navigate what they need to do and what they're kind of sitting with and need some help with, and then they'll take them through that kind of plan. So we've had a real change in clinical psychologists as an organisation, and how we think of them in our British Psychological Society, which is kind of our accreditation body, similar to the General Medical Council. We've gone through a real change around what that might mean, that we aren't experts, we aren't all-knowing individuals, that actually a lot of what we're engaging with at a clinical level is mostly around kind of not necessarily all about trauma, but finding places where people can speak, finding places where people can share what they ultimately are struggling. They haven't necessarily found that space anywhere else. So where we used to think psychiatry was leading the way with a drugs regime and we could treat people, now actually it's a lot more about giving people the room to self-define, to talk themselves through the process, and to allow them the space to have a talking space, basically. So clinical psychology's changed a lot over the years.
Again, 10 questions jumping off the back of it there. So when I hear that, they are treating the symptom versus the cause. And that's kind of also connects for me this overused term, and I use it too much and I probably don't fully understand it. I have a cursory understanding of psychological safety, which is an environment where we're trying to create safe space for people to communicate. I would love to see, and it's something I've spoken a lot about on the podcast, fire and rescue services, and also first responders in general, because my brother-in-law is a paramedic and I'm acutely aware of the challenges that they go through. We don't have a lot of clinical psychologists working in the emergency services, specifically hired by those individuals. And then when we try and say things like psychological safety, again, it's so very personal that I don't think we're self-aware enough to pull ourselves out of our own unconscious biases, because the people that make it to the top of organizations, as an example, tend to be very driven, hopefully very passionate as well, but certainly very driven, very type A individuals, and their perception of psychological safety for people who are different from them, who perhaps don't have the same psychological makeup, you're trying to create an environment for someone who is based in a very different mindset to what you are. And that's when we perpetually go through this cycle of health and well-being in the fire and rescue service as one example, where we can't seem to be able to find the right answers for people, or we can't find the right environments for them to be able to communicate things. But we don't seem to, in a lot of organisations, have made that leap as to hiring. I mean, I don't know how much a clinical psychologist costs, and I'm getting into solution mode as firefighters do, but I'm going to punch a number out there and say £60,000 a year. I think someone's gone through 4 or 5 years of study. My apologies if it's longer than that, but somebody with a master's degree probably wants at least 50k a year to be in an employment like that, supporting a large organisation. And we do this all the time with nurses and with physical therapists, and we tend to think about health and well-being very much as a physical thing. And I think we're in a very, I hate using the word journey, but we are on that journey as to fully understanding that the long-term problems for people now don't really sit around musculoskeletal injuries and debility, although menopause and musculoskeletal are lots of issues that do cause people to leave the job earlier than intended, or they have to transition into a different role. I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and you might know better than me, the biggest lost time cost for employees, and employees make up roughly 80%, I think, the cost of most organisations. The leading loss of time for them became mental health and stress. I'm not sure, when did you start seeing the pendulum shift into that being the greatest concern for organisations?
So 22, 25, whatever it was, years ago when I started, there was the dialogue was in a different place. And that sounds a bit pretentious to say it that way, but it really was. It was very much around enforcement. So in general, across all different organisations, not just the Fire and Rescue Service, the Health and Safety Executive were trying to get things like organisational stress and other mental health and wellbeing aspects really attended to by organisations. They were trying to effectively get it recognised on their agendas, in discussions, in kind of management groups, those kind of things. And so it was a lot about recognition and enforcement. And then I think we went through a bit of a period where we actually just realised it's about caring and being kind to people. And we probably should be doing that anyway. And so I think now there's more of an understanding that actually we can look at some of those statistics. And the statistics that went before, there's a lot of discussion in the literature around how sometimes somebody would be reporting one reason as to why they were off, but actually underlying that might have been mental health and well-being, but it wasn't necessarily recorded as such. In some places when I first started, that wasn't even actually an option to say why you were off, why you weren't at work at that point. Mm-hmm. So I think some of that is around we're recording and have opportunity for recording those statistics better. And there's also something, and it's not entirely there, I don't think, and it's something that we are trying to work on, is actually having permission to say, this is the reason why I'm off. I'm not feeling at my best because of my mental health or because of my well-being, rather than constantly having to mask that with stomach illness or whatever else it was that we tend to see those patterns in the past. So sorry, that was a very long answer.
No. I love a long. I'm trying to get better, and the listener might notice, hopefully, at not interrupting people, because my ADHD goes crazy with my 7 ideas, and I have a little pad down to my left that I jot notes on because it stops me interrupting. I share quite a personal thing. Over the last 24 months, I went through a variety of things, all of my own self-creation. Very long investigation based around me in the workplace, nothing illegal. A divorce, and a perpetual challenge with addiction and ADHD, which I've had for probably all of my life, but only noted for the past 15 years, probably. Yeah, it was only recognised the last 15 years. 15 years? Yeah, 15 years when I started going through recovery. And it was only when I was moved through 3 different departments, not because I wasn't playing nice with friends, just because they ran out of things for me to do, so they shifted me somewhere else whilst the thing was ongoing. And I arrived at an individual who was very, very consummate professional and was very well read on the subject of health and well-being. And he was the first person who ever did a workplace stress assessment with me. And again, I'm going to fumble my way through this and I won't do justice to the individual who said it, and you'll probably know it better than me. But he said this has been part of, health and safety legislation for X number of years, a very, very long time. But it makes me zoom out and look at the more holistic development that we give leaders, managers, people who are placed in positions to care for people's well-being, and they're very ill-equipped, not because they don't care, not because they're not interested, because they've perhaps just never even considered it. And as organisations, I don't think we're training people as to how and why and what our obligations are. We can't just go, oh, we've got a PDF that says go and talk to the Firefighters charity. That's not enough. Okay, that is not you doing. And I didn't know any of this until I went through this situation. The investigation thing is finished, but and I've still got my job. But it was only when I went through this, the individual laid all this out to me and said he was unsurprised, but still perpetually frustrated and disappointed that through this entire ordeal, no one has come to me and thought to do a workplace stress assessment, not to get me out of the job, not to put me on performance and development or anything like that, just to help me re-enter the workplace. And I didn't actually have any time off, but for me to show up with the fullness of myself. I think we have this audacity when we say bring yourself to work. Like, I think we should have a bring yourself to work day. When you say like bring your kids to work day, bring yourself to work day, because I wonder how little of people they're actually bringing to work. Now, of course, if you're horrible, racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, then you shouldn't be in the workplace anyway. But I think when we talk about that psychological safety, I remember Simon Sinek talks about it, that how much of our cognitive horsepower are we spending worrying about everybody else, worrying about our safety, worrying about judgment, worrying about dealing with our day-to-day life? What percentage of ourselves do we really think? What percentage of ourselves do you think people are able to bring to work? This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
I don't think we could put a percentage on that, and I think the reason, and this isn't a slopey shoulder answer, it's for exactly the reasons that you've just shared with us. So first of all, I'm sorry that you've gone through a tough time, and I hope you're okay. But I think all of those different situations are playing out in different people's lives that mean that percentage will vary over the course of a career, over the course of different jobs, over the course of what's happening in the home life, over the course of what's happening in geopolitics. That different way in which people are trying to navigate and marry up all the different aspects of their lives and try and make sure that nothing's falling over and all the plates keep spinning, means that there is no consistent percentage. What we should be doing, though, is exactly as you've just highlighted, is understanding that flux is. And that flux isn't just around what's happening in the workplace context, it's what's happening in the other domains of that person's life, because they don't just show up in the work context. They're also showing up at home. They're also showing up as a friend. They're also showing up having, so before we started recording, me and you were talking about, our pets that we have. They're managing their pet's illness. All these different things that is life. What we tend to do with work policies with health and wellbeing is just think about that person in the workplace and what's going on there. And actually some of the things that are going on in the workplace, some of the things that are going on outside the workplace, those things start stacking up sometimes. And so somebody's ability to be themselves, to be present, to be fully engaged in those different work tasks, and wanting to pay it forward and invest and do all those things. Actually, there's a whole load of other stuff that they're doing just trying to get through the day. And I think sometimes we don't necessarily allow or are comfortable with the home life and the social perspective coming into the workplace, because it feels like, well, what can I do to manage it? Well, we aren't necessarily asking people to manage it, because nobody can manage somebody else's world. No. What we're asking to do is to take that into account and to be considerate and to support that individual in managing those as they're going through them. That's the kind of thing, I think, that where the policies sometimes aren't designed in a way that we would notice those things. Usually we tend to find that it's the social support work that might kick up a gear, that somebody might say, are you all right? Because you just don't seem yourself at the moment, or you seem a bit distant, like what's going on? And so that sense of being connected to one another, I think sometimes we don't necessarily embody a policy in that way, or embody an approach in that way, or embody a management or a leadership course set of toolkits and materials in that way. Actually, sometimes they're ways to facilitate conversation, to say, I'm connected to you and I care about you, and I really want to know what's going on in your world as much as you want to share with me. How can we support you to get through what you're going through at the moment? And I think that gets a bit lost.
Now, if we take ourselves to the worst end of that spectrum, you wrote a great piece of literature, academic literature, that was commissioned by AFSA, the Asian Fire Service Association, which is where we first met. This came out in February of 2022, the one that I'm going to be referencing now. And my apologies if there's, I imagine there's constant research and literature coming up to date, and perhaps you can connect the dots for us. But this was around the review of death by suicide in the UK Fire and Rescue Service. And it's one part of our conversation today that I really would love to spend a little bit of time on. What was your initial interaction with this through your professional capacity? And we'll give contributions to Nottingham Trent University for the donation of your time as well. Talk to us about how this piece of work came about.
So we were the chief executive of the Firefighters charity at the time, and AFSA were having quite a few conversations around some of the events that are quite well reported, and you could probably name them, and your listeners are probably quite aware of them, in different fire and rescue services across the UK, and particularly events that were happening in London. AFSA, quite rightly, were very, very concerned, saying, what can we do about this? And one of the ways in which the Firefighters Charity and AFSA like to work is that they like to use evidence-based decision-making, evidence-based practice to make sure that what we're doing isn't kind of a gut reaction or just based purely on experience, that it's actually, there's some form of evidence base under there. So the first thing we did was went to the evidence, and there was very little out there for the fire and rescue services. So they commissioned myself and a colleague, Professor Karen Slade, who is one of the leading researchers and practitioners in both prison and probation service around self-harm and also death by suicide, to really understand how we could use those greater, bigger understandings in a more generalised set of UK organisations and population, how we can understand what might travel across to the fire and rescue service, whether there are particularly anything that might demonstrate a higher risk for that population to death by suicide, and to really try and understand where we currently were with our knowledge base on it. So we produced that piece of work, and that then led on to further pieces of work that we've now done, hopefully producing some practical toolkits, and some really very specifically designed for the fire and rescue service community guides and help guides, well, not policies, but it's more. So you'll see on some of the things that we have shared with you, and hopefully you can share with your listeners, that we have produced things like I'm worried about myself or I'm worried about somebody else. And they're written very much around in the fire and rescue service because we know that there are some differences with that population. And so we try to be very bespoke.
So when we were carrying out this I didn't do anything. When you were carrying out this academic literature, also just one question before we do carry on. When did it transition from committing suicide to death by suicide? Because it used to be considered a crime, didn't it? I forget, it was probably decades ago, but I think a lot of people still have it in their vernacular that they say committing suicide.
They do. And I think, so I can't remember the date specifically, but it still is, commonly referred to as committing suicide. And I think not only is there the association with the kind of the legal side of things that no longer is there, there's also something that around the families and the friends who are survivors of death by suicide, so those who have been bereaved, that it's trying to get away from. This isn't a choice that somebody elects to do. This is perceived, we think, we don't know because we aren't able to speak with anybody that's successfully done these this act, but it's around trying to understand that this is the only solution that they possibly saw at that time. So they've gone through everything else. This isn't kind of a solution that they've created and they've elected to do. This is literally, they feel that there's nothing else that they could do at that time. So the commit is really a loaded term that we've really struggled with, I think, in the UK. And we're trying to move away from that so that we can have a much better and more informed conversation around how we could understand what an individual who might be on a pathway to death by suicide, where and how and what they might be feeling, and how we can try and interrupt that pathway.
It's often termed as a permanent solution to a temporary problem, isn't it? But temporary almost seems slightly condescending to people because you're suggesting that whatever they're experiencing is small or insignificant, or that it will. I mean, in the fullness of time, all of these things will pass or change or evolve just out of perseverance. But again, that comes with an accusation that these people are not gritting down and persevering or something to that extent. I don't love, but I find fascinating when you describe there that someone is on a pathway to death by suicide. That is very interesting terminology, something I've not heard before, but certainly, and again, a lot of this is no doubt within the documentation that we'll put in the links below. Take me back to literature before we carry on that thread, or you feel free to carry on that thread, but where did we go to source this information? Who did we speak to? What were some of the prevailing feelings and evidence that came out of it? This episode is brought to you in partnership with MSA Safety. Today we have them to thank for the improved firefighter safety through connectivity in their brand new connected firefighter system. At the center of the connected firefighter platform is the MSA M1 SCBA with telemetry. That integrates straight in with the Luna system, which is a wireless all-in-one device creating an independent search and rescue network, providing edge detection, enhanced personal thermal imaging, while simplifying post-scene reporting and data retention. All of this then plugs into the FireGrid system for cloud-based connectivity, real-time information, and data-driven decisions for the incident commander. MSA are truly taking massive strides in the future of improved firefighter safety through connectivity in the brand new MSA Connected Firefighter platform. Now back to the show.
So I think one of the first things that we tried to do was we tried to understand whether there was statistics would reflect a greater risk, because it felt at the time, anecdotally, that there seemed to be many more instances of death by suicide in the fire and rescue service at that point in time. And what we wanted to understand was that a feeling because we heard about more of them? Was that a feeling because there was a greater risk within this occupation and within this sector? Or was this something we were noticing because actually we'd had the pandemic, we were going into a cost of living crisis, and unfortunately we know one of the impacts of that is that the general population, we will see a rise in death by suicide. So was this something that we were seeing and feeling, but actually the wider UK population was also going through? And so we tried to understand that from a statistics point of view. AFSA and the Firefighters Charity were very clear whether that was a general increase in the population or whichever of those three options. One death is one death too many. So the response was very, but it was trying to accurately diagnose the problem that we were trying to face. So one of the challenges with that is that the Office for National Statistics data, one, there's a big time lag in that because only a coroner can, and I'm sure most of your listeners will know because they've been in many coroners' courts, but only coroners can actually attribute death by suicide. So there's a big time lag of at least 3 months, if not 6 or 9 months. So real-time data is a problem in that greater sense anyway, and there's lots of different work that's been done by different task force and also by the government to try and speed up so that we can accurately figure out if there's some form of movement, particularly an upwards movement in that data more generally. But particularly for the Fire and Rescue Service, the occupation clusters that are within that data aren't really specific. We can kind of make inferences about where the Fire and Rescue Service might sit, and they've actually got better since we did that original piece of work. So my colleague Karen Slade is constantly tracking that data for us, and just sent an update, I think about 3 weeks ago, to the Firefighters Charity to say where we are with that. The other literature that I think ties into your curiosity around why I'm using the language of pathway to suicide was there's been quite a difference in how we're understanding what might happen before in order for somebody to reach the point where they feel that there's no other option than to take their own life. And so what we find with those models, it's the models, the most kind of, in science we have this thing that we can't ever completely understand something, apart from, gravity, for example. We can kind of understand that and measure it. But particularly with social sciences and life sciences, or social sciences particularly, it's trying to get as accurate explanations as possible, knowing that things might change, the context might change, because a lot of social science is around looking at people and how we're enacting in the situation that we're in. So what was quite a biological understanding has now moved to this concept of a pathway. So there might be a predetermining aspect of your formative years and how that might have influenced your an individual's kind of coping mechanisms and those kind of things. But actually there's also this other aspect that there is either a chain or a compounding effect of lots of different events happening in an individual's life. And that's what we understand to be that kind of pathway to getting to a point where death by suicide might be a consideration. As well as that, there is also, we know, the impact of being exposed to, and this is where this occupation is different, being exposed to methods that have been used by others that have been successful. And those in the prevention world, those in certainly in response, will probably have had some form of experience in their operational career that they have responded to those kind of incidents, be they ones where that person has died, or be they where they've arrived, and they're trying to rescue them. And they'll be working with the health professionals at that point, obviously. So we know that that's a cursor, and you'll notice in the language that the media are held accountable for is a lot of the time it might be reported in public interest news stories, be they celebrities or whoever else, that there has been a death by suicide, but they have stopped reporting the means by which that death by suicide has occurred, and that's partly to do with that as well. So there's the means, and there's also some other aspects that we're still trying to understand, something around the presence of alcohol. And we don't actually think that's something to do with alcohol per se, but the consequence of alcohol, that you might have a lower inhibition. And we also know that there might be something that is attributable to the ability to withstand pain. a higher propensity to pain. So there's lots of different facets that we still don't understand. But we do know that if those kind of the more predetermined formative years element is there, we know that there are a series of what feel to that individual, we think, as an escalating and also multiple domain. So there's something that might be happening in one aspect of life that has a consequence to another part of their life, that has a consequence to another part. However, we do know that you can have two individuals that experience similar patterns. One might take the action to successfully perform death by suicide, and somebody might actually not. We still don't understand what that might be. What it does mean is that where we started some of the conversation today, the health and well-being care that comes before all of that, the noticing that somebody might feel a little bit more disengaged than they usually are, then, you know, when they're talking about what's going on in their life with the general checkups that we do every day, hi, how are you? But when we go beyond those social scripts of going, yeah, sure, because actually nobody really wants to know everything that's going on, or we perceive that nobody wants to know what's really going on in our lives. You know, this happened and then that happened, and this morning it wasn't just a nightmare. When we actually do check in with one another, and we are noticing that different aspects, or we know that something's going on in the workplace that might mean that they are dealing with more than they're usually dealing with. If we then foresee that that might have consequences in other domains of their life, then that is the time to really care about that person and step up and start those conversations that we're not quite sure how to have. And, you know, we have some of that in the Firefighters Charity kind of guides that we have, how to start those conversations to say, are you all right? And are you starting to feel that there's nowhere to go with this? How are you thinking around the future? Those conversations in a more gentle way, in a personalised way, that's where we really wanted to take the literature to be something that is useful, that is amenable, that somebody can go, I think I need to have this conversation. I'm just going to Google the Firefighters Charity, suicide prevention, and then something, you just scroll down the page and something will come up and I can quickly click on that, and then I can go and have a conversation. And the final kind of piece of the jigsaw is that once we'd understood that context and once we'd figured out what that might look like when we put all those different pieces of evidence together, and we'd written the guides, the Firefighters Charity and the NFCC negotiated the crisis line. So this is different to those of your listeners who are eligible, who might have used the Firefighters Charity before, where you kind of ring up and you say, actually, you know, I've got a bust knee and I really need some help with this because I want to get back to work. Or more importantly, I want to have a long and happy life that I can do all the things that I want to do in it outside of my job. This is a specific crisis line for those people who are worried about themselves or who are worried about others, who feel that there might be an action that's about to be taken place. So that crisis line is now up and running. Unfortunately, it's probably more used than we hoped it would be.
And we will make sure that we put these links with the Firefighters Charity and the useful resources. It really is important about making these things deployable, because it is a very impossible question, isn't it? Especially for a researcher, I would imagine, in the social sciences, because it's the old saying, if you forgive the gender bias within it, but a man never enters the same river twice, because the river's not the same and neither is the man, you know. And like you say, you try and capture an evidence from COVID or whenever there's an interesting thing in Change as well, where they talk about complex versus complicated. Like you say, gravity and physics is complicated, but it's also predictable, whereas people and anything in the social sciences are always so very complex. And to try and force yourself to draw a line at the comparisons must be incredibly difficult, because otherwise you end up down so many rabbit holes that deviate off into isolated metrics that can't be used for comparison with other people, because we're talking about people's, you know, upbringings, their nature, their nurture, their work, their exposure, their social infrastructure, their support network that they have at home. All of these aspects are incredibly complex, but as you already alluded to, that doesn't justify us to go, oh, this is too difficult. This is too difficult. We're just going to have to say, pat on the back, do your best. But you're right about those uncomfortable conversations, because I think we just fear what the other person's going to say. I think I found that so many times. I mean, I was trying to think as you were speaking then when you said about experiences that people would have. I think I've maybe been to about 18 successful death by suicide. And even in that word, like if you saw it on social media or LinkedIn or whatever, and somebody said, oh, we're very sorry to communicate the successful death by suicide of our colleague XYZ. There's almost a what's the word I'm looking for? There's not a hypocrisy, but there's I forget what the word is, but where it's like jumbo shrimp. You know what I mean? Where the two opposing words contradict each other. You know, someone has successfully completed death by suicide. It is a very, very difficult thing to wrap your head around, just the way that we term it. But I understand and appreciate we're trying to take the accusation and the guilt and because also I think in places like the military, and I don't know if it is, I'm pretty sure it's not the first responder community now, but in the military, if you had committed suicide as it was then, you wouldn't get your pension, you wouldn't get anything, would you? And again, I'm not trying to bash the military, but I think there's many examples where if you had died by suicide, then you're almost not entitled to lots of things. The team here at the podcast are extremely excited to announce our brand new partnership with Patrol Store UK. Patrol Store has been serving the UK's police, fire and emergency communities and first responder sector since 2008, providing leading brands such as Hikes, Magnum, 511, Nebo, Op Zulu, Highlander, AKU and many, many more of our favourites. They are now also supplying bespoke uniform, PPE and station workwear to fire services around the UK. So for all our listeners that are part of your USAR, your HEART team, your ISAR team, your armed response teams, your fire investigation, your NALO, your hazmat and all of the training departments that have got your own budgets, be sure to get the absolute best for your team at a realistic price by contacting Aaron and the team at Patrol Store and referencing the Firefighters Podcast. Patrol Store will also be taking part in our listener competition giveaways, as well as providing unique discounts to podcast listeners. So for people that are always asking about Hikes boots as an example, that is one unique discount code that is coming to you very soon through Patrol Store. We've also got some incredible bags. I mean, the Op Zulu bags are a game changer. So you know the really Gucci and expensive tactical black bags that everyone's using in CrossFit workouts and taking to the gym and taking to stations? Well, they've basically got that, but it's made better and costs less, because they're not slapping some Gucci expensive brand name on it and it's giving you what you want on a first responder salary. Be sure to keep your eyes in the notes of the episodes for links to unique offers and discount codes. And if you're looking to buy well and buy once, be sure to get in the notes and head over to Patrol Store UK. Now back to the show.
Yeah, and I think that is definitely changed, which is good. But I also think certainly, you know, the kind of the death by suicide we use in that report and we're using in this conversation to mean a certain specific set of kind of groupings of how somebody might have died. But actually the overwhelming thing that I think we need to focus on is that person's died. We're sorry to hear about, you know, that person's death. It's that we have that kind of legacy that where we do have a slight, I don't know, well, we do have kind of suicidal ideation that is a normal part of humanity. Sometimes we do have periods where we wonder, and that isn't necessarily because we're in a place where a lot of things are happening or not happening, but that's because we have the ability to fantasize and the ability to think of states and places and minds and everything else that aren't our own. But that isn't, I think, part of that way in which we've got a history of thinking of that in a different way than we have if somebody's died by natural causes, by medical intervention going wrong, by, you know, an RTC, whatever that may be. There's still something quite, there's still a history and a legacy that we're dealing with there. But ultimately, it's a set of circumstances that has led to that place, in exactly the same way that you could argue for those other ways that somebody has that's no longer with us, that's died.
We talk about, so a few things that you also mentioned. One was around the proliferation and our awareness of it. Like, is it just that we are more aware of it? Because now we live in a global village of social media. You can hear what's happening in Australian fire service or, FDNY or wherever else. Or even, I really protect my mind from social media, from the news. I never watch the news. I feel it almost offensive that we call it news anymore. There was a great book, I think it was by a psychologist actually, called, was it Neil Postman, Entertaining Ourselves to Death? I think he said it was a book, and it was about when they first started putting music to the news, and they said it's not news anymore. This is a show. This is a performance, and it's catastrophizing and putting you all in a sense of doom. But also, that's not to say that a lot of these things aren't happening. But I think when we look at suicide, it's much more upsetting for me, because when you know of it, someone close by to you, like if I hear of a woman being sexually assaulted in South Africa, or there's a horrific war going on somewhere in the world, okay, is that in my sphere of influence? Is it in my sphere of control? Likely not. It's very sad. If it were close by, at some point I would be urged to action to help or assist or do something locally. Locally might mean nationally or regionally or whatever it might be. But when it's someone within your world, it does come with sometimes a spoken but often an unspoken sense of, could I have done more? And that's what really bothers me when I do see communications from organisations. And they'll know, like, well, I've seen a few of them, I've read a few of them, where they will communicate to the individual's family, and there will be the sorrow and the unfortunate circumstances, but then underlying there's also someone's maybe advised them to write something in and around, we did all we could, and I struggle with that a bit sometimes. And again, it's not out of malice, but are we educated on what to do about it? You say you did all you clearly didn't do enough. Everybody in this person's world, there's a slice of accountability for all of us, and also a large chunk of accountability for the individual themselves, to acknowledge that for whatever reasons, we didn't create enough circumstances and situations where this person could communicate the challenges that they were going through to the extent that they felt these were not permanent problems, and that through the assistance and support of those around them, they could find a resolution. This is not a dark cave. This is a tunnel, and there is light at the end of this tunnel. And how do we navigate ourselves towards that? So take me into, when we're speaking about perhaps difficult conversations, or even the numbers you said nationally, or from the information you'd taken, if you could just give us some of those numbers when you said that you felt there'd been a decline, or the numbers suggested there was a decline. In death by suicide in fire and rescue service personnel. Yeah. I don't know whether we know that there is a decline, because I don't think we know the numbers enough. So okay. when in the Office of National Statistics, they're kind of in two bigger pots of occupation groupings. And so what we're doing is, between those two different kind of groupings, we've identified the relevant ones, extracted those, and then compared them to the national populations. And what we find is that they are running pretty stable at the moment. And despite our best predictions, but I would crucially say also a vast amount of effort. When we have a cost of living crisis, when we have kind of post-pandemic, where our public services are pretty worn out. So there isn't necessarily the statutory help at the moment that we would necessarily get, whether you're in the service or not, outside of your organisation. We at a national level, we've put a lot of energy into trying to make sure that those numbers remain relatively stable. We aren't in a place yet where we can probably try to decrease them, but they are relatively stable, and we see those kind of in the fire and rescue service as well. We expect them to increase with the cost of living crisis, with destabilisation in geopolitics across the world, because
people find the larger context, and it is another aspect of kind of why they may feel more vulnerable, why they may feel that this is another thing that's going wrong, that there isn't necessarily a solution for, that they can see, as well as their own personal set of circumstances as well. So they're at the moment they're relatively stable, and that brings me back to kind of AFSA and the firefighters charity of one death is one death too many, because unlike a road traffic collision, well, maybe not, but we can check the car, we can check the consistency of it, we can make sure that everybody's got good training to use the road, we can do all of those things to try and reduce road traffic collisions. So good health and well-being policies will reduce the chances of somebody being where they're not supported, they feel as though they can't necessarily find that space and that place for help, but also that other people are actively noticing and approaching them with exactly the kind of process that you shared with us earlier on around can we have a conversation that isn't frightening, but a conversation that means, how can we help you? What do you need from us? What is there in this kind of bigger aspect of your life that means that we might need to give you extra resources? And by extra resources, that makes it sound like, it's better PPE or something. It's extra resources as in what do you think would help you through this? And can we find that? Can we make sure that you can get that from somewhere? And that's where I think, when we talked about that health and well-being support, is it really around understanding what's going on in somebody else's kind of other domains of their life, rather than what you can just see when they're present at work. So some of the examples that we use are things like, let's swap occupations for a minute. If you're a paramedic, for example, you mentioned paramedics earlier on, and for some reason there's a lot going on in the content of your world, your ability or you're feeling that you are maybe burnt out with the nature of your job. You can't necessarily feel as though you can share that with somebody, and so therefore you might self-medicate, you might start drinking more, you might then be done for drunk driving, you lose your license, it then affects your job, it then affects your home life, it then affects your ability to see your children. All those things are where those things start stacking up. Noticing and knowing that those things might all be happening in somebody's life is where good health and wellbeing support will come in. And that isn't just around what an organisation has laid down around procedurally what to do. It's also around an organisation that's built on the premise of we're all connected and we all belong to this organisation and we take care of each other, and we're interested and active, and it's important to us that we all feel as though we're at the best that we can be. And if we're not, then we'll all help each other to be the best that we can be, and we'll notice when people are off boil, we'll notice when people and we'll make those connections. So how do you feel about that change in your life? Is everything okay? Are you feeling that's it's going to be tough, but do you feel as though you have everything that you need to make that adjustment, or other things that we can do to help? Those are the kind of conversations that I think, and the way that the strategic effect should be of those policies and those procedures of health and well-being to achieve that people have a sense of belonging, they have a sense of connectedness, and they get the sense that people genuinely care, and that it's not a tick box exercise, that your well-being and your health matters to your organisation, not because of your productivity, and not only because of your effectiveness to do your job, because they're proud in what you can do in your role, but also because they want you to be a flourishing human being.
That final bit about being a flourishing human being, that hits almost to an upsetting extent, because I think people will hear everything you're saying at the minute, and it's very sad that what you're saying, I think, will become as very refreshing to people. But I also forgive organisations for the tremendous economic pressure that they are under, but there's almost an analogy to be drawn from. We spoke earlier, I think, around funding, and 80% of funding goes to people's wages. People are your most valuable asset. They're the things that do the things, front room, back room, operational, non-operational, green, grey, everyone in the bucket, in the family all together. They're your greatest asset. And that's where we should be investing our time and our resource, not to sit and hold hands and sing Kumbaya out in the garden all day long and get nothing done, but really, really put in that time into those individuals. And again, I'll reference back to like that workplace stress assessment. Again, the terminology that's given to it may make it feel like a very formal thing, but the way it was facilitated for me personally was a very, very, very calm and open dialogue. It was we had the conversation. It took a long time. I think it took about 2 hours, and we didn't even complete it. I think we only got through like 2 sections, and then I spent time by myself filling in bits, and there was no right or wrong answers. There was no like 1 to 5 spectrum or anything like that. It was just a safe place to me to dump all of my thoughts, and the way that it was navigated didn't lift the weight of responsibility from the line manager that I was working with, but he was very transparent about the fact that there's many things within here that will be outside our sphere of control, like me and you as a team who are trying to work on improving your life circumstances and hopefully a desire to stay with this organisation because we care about you. And the things that were within our sphere of control, things that were small adaptations for that person or for that organisation, but would make a massive difference for me. Would make a massive difference for me, and are the source of so much anxiety and fear and just uncertainty. Because as you alluded to earlier with the global economical geopolitical elements, that aspect of uncertainty and that aspect of lack of autonomy. Can I do anything about this? I'm helpless. I am at the mercy. I'm a leaf in the wind being blown from left to right, and I'm struggling to hold on. Could I ask you around the indicators? So if we were to think about people that are on that pathway, what are some of the things, and again, a lot of this may be common knowledge to people, so please forgive my silly question, but for those, let's assume nothing of the listener and just really lay out some of the things that they should have in their mental framework that perhaps aren't a concern for them, but should certainly be things to be looking out for in changes to people's life circumstances that may require them to step in and just ensure that support is there. Ever heard the quote that true leaders are readers? Well, we believe this is true. Listeners often ask where we go to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in the sector globally. So there are a few key publications which I encourage you to go check out. Now, if you're looking for insights on disaster management, fire protection and firefighting, for us, we go to Asia Pacific Fire Magazine. And when you're looking for the latest on the Middle East fire protection industry and fire services, it's Gulf Fire Magazine. And our quarterly check-in is with International Firefighter Magazine, reporting to municipal, industrial and fire training professionals. Now, next up, and widely accepted to be the global voice for passive and active fire protection, this is a good one. It's International Fire Protection Magazine. And finally, and perhaps the most relevant to our predominantly UK audience, I'd strongly suggest subscribing to UK Fire Magazine, reporting to the United Kingdom fire protection industry and fire services. We're really excited to announce that after a long-standing relationship and mutual respect, we've now partnered with MDM Publishing, who bring you all of these essential publications. Because in a world of change, the learners shall inherit the earth, while the learned shall find themselves perfectly suited for a world that no longer exists. Eric Hoffer said that, and I believe he was right. So keep growing, keep learning, and keep yourself in the know and at the cutting edge of what's happening globally by dropping into the notes. And as a gift from the podcast, you can actually subscribe to any of these publications for free using the link in our notes. Now back to the show.
Of course, and unfortunately, there's no one set of risk factors, because in amongst kind of the other aspect of the risk factors is also that person might have really great social support. They might have really great coping mechanisms that are well used. So I think but what there is things like big life events. Death of a close loved one, or somebody close to them. Moving house, significant relationship breakdown. I don't think there's, in the work that we've done after the different reports and evidence reviews that we did, I don't think there's anything that I've been involved in across the fire and rescue service that hasn't had some element of a significant relationship breakdown. There's also anything at work that we know that might put undue stress on somebody, that might be quite a challenging situation to go through. And it's when you notice that those things are starting to come in a stack or in a sequence, that you can infer that there'll be other consequences going on that you can't see.
This is very much starting to sound like a personal coaching call.
But it's those kind of elements to be aware of, and then to be, if you feel comfortable, and if you don't know how, then have a look at the guides. But just to open that conversation and ask around how are you feeling. The thing that I would say around your experience that you shared with us so well, and I'll contrast one with a personal experience of mine. Is sometimes I think sometimes we know there's an element of being in something doesn't necessarily mean that you can talk about it, because it might be that you can't label it, because you're feeling your feeling, if you get what I mean, but you aren't necessarily recognising what it is.
Yeah.
So, being a wellbeing researcher for the past 25 years, certainly for me, I did experience the death of a loved one. My nan died, who I was very close to. My relationship broke down. I moved. My job changed. And at that point, I remember feeling very disengaged. And I remember thinking, I can't actually describe what I'm feeling right now. I don't have the words for it. But I know I'm not feeling enough. And that worries me. I should be worried about myself.
I felt numb.
Yeah,
vacant.
it's totally.
I felt like I was observing the world.
Yeah, and then I practice what you preach. So I reached out to my employee assistance program, and I remember that first phone call was, I don't really know why I'm ringing you, and I don't really know how to understand and to tell you what I need, but I know I need something, and I need help in figuring out what I need. And then realised I was completely emotionally burnt out, just because all of those things were so intense that that burnout was, for me, what was making me feel disengaged and numb and unable to fully experience life in the way that I usually do. So that kind of just understanding that something is different, I think, is one of those bigger kind of health and well-being principles. Is around, do we we say it's okay not to be okay. To me, I don't think that's enough. It's okay not to be okay, but we want you to be okay again, and we want you to be your okay. We don't want a predetermined set of whatever we think happiness looks like. It's what your usual kind of patterns of behaviour, your styles of interaction, where you feel that you are at your best. To be able to manage and emotionally regulate your moods and where you are, those kind of things. If you notice any disruption to those, just from a self-checking in point of view, I think those are the conversations and the kind of the reflective element of managing our own well-being and understanding when actually we need to be the ones that go, I'm not quite sure what's going on here, but I don't think I'm Rowena anymore, and I can't find her, and I need help here, and I don't know what I need, but I do need help in understanding what's going on here. Though I think there's some element of accountability. I think when you described your experience there, you were putting emotions and terms and words in that actually I think a lot of people wouldn't be necessarily that reflexive about, just purely because it isn't in our common conversations. That kind of historical legacy that we have in the UK around how much of that emotional visibility and emotional literacy we give people. I think sometimes that means that we aren't quite sure how to have those conversations about how we're feeling. And that isn't to say, as you say, we all sit in the garden and sing Come By Our. It's actually around, I actually want to live my life to the full and be the best that I can be. And I'm not quite sure I am at the moment. I don't know why that is. Can I just have some help to figure that out? It's those kind of asks I think sometimes we also need to be aware of.
Yeah. I'm keen to understand how we can, and again, not to be remotely condescending, so only some of the, try and say this without blowing smoke at my own bum, some of the ways that I'm able to articulate some of the things that I've gone through have only been learned behaviours, which I imagine they have for all of us, but mine came from 15 years ago when I went through recovery, and that was a very isolated thing on its own, equally very difficult, but I had a tremendous amount of support eventually from my parents and my family and my partner at the time. But that forces an enormous amount of self-reflection and in just perpetual, just like machine gun awkward conversations for at least a 7 or 8 month period as you start to move through the early stages of recovery. And you've gone through your own experiences, but equally you've done a tremendous amount of academic research, study, learnings into this. And I know this is the work that you've done, and we will lay this out in the links that people can find underneath this podcast. But how do we dilute that down so that we don't have to rely on people? Dilute is almost slightly offensive as well, perhaps, but to make these deployable. And I suppose what I'm asking for you is to take us through verbally some of the step-by-step elements of how to recognize that in someone else, how to begin to engage in those conversations. And I apologize if I'm asking you to repeat yourself, because I know you've already alluded to some of this during our conversation today, because they often say your superpower sits right next to your biggest scar. And the reason you have an awareness for something is because you've gone through something. I'm not sure that's a very useful template to say to everybody, you need to run an ultra marathon before you can help anybody learn to run. I'm not sure that's necessary. You haven't had to go through a tremendous personal setback or setting fire to your own life in order to understand how to get somebody out. Because that's like, if everybody had to do that, the percentage of people that are, like when I was going through my thing, I've had a number of personal injuries over the years of torn tendons and prolapsed discs and all this sort of stuff. If I think if I had experienced one of those during that period of time as well, and I'd have lost my independence and mobility, I'm not sure I'd be having this conversation with you today. So I always think we're only 2 or 3 tectonic life shifts away from hitting the big red self-destruct button. So I don't think anybody is not vulnerable to this. I think it can, no matter who you are and how stoic you think you are and how self-aware you believe yourself to be, I think you're only 2 or 3 tectonic shifts away from that personally. But take us to how in the absence of those experiences, how people can support others.
Thank you, Ian. I think for the Fire and Rescue Service particularly, we see it across all different roles and all different levels. We talk a lot about peer support. Peer support is the most powerful thing. So when you kind of diagnose that or look at what it is, what its constituent parts are, from kind of an academic theoretical point of view, it's social support. So it's a relatively non-judgmental space that you can talk about the things that are on your mind or that you are concerned around, and you get an appreciative reaction back. Somebody is holding that for you and allowing you to talk, and is sympathetic, is empathetic, is curious about how you might feel about those things, and then may share some opportunity for you to say how you might feel as though you might move forward with those different aspects. So they are somebody who has enough understanding of what you go through within your role, for you not to be monitoring. We see that, we talked about clinical psychologists earlier on. clinical psychologists are fab. What we do find in the literature is sometimes when they have the opportunity or when firefighters have the opportunity to share with them, they try to manage the reaction of the clinical psychologist if they're talking about particular things that are events and incidences and describing the nature of those. They try to impression manage, not in a way for social desirability, but they try just to take care of them to make sure that the description of that incident isn't too impactful on that individual. We find in peer support, we don't necessarily have to do that. So the peer support aspect, I think, taking that on board and knowing that, all those kind of phrases of be a good friend, be a good mate, kind of care about your colleagues. I don't think there's anything really as a first set of principles rather than kind of, and I know you're not asking me for one, but, if people are looking for kind of scripts or, anything like that, I don't think there is one. It's around caring about somebody and being kind and being empathetic, noticing when they may be behaving differently to how you would behave, and not just thinking if there's some form of behaviour change, not just thinking, well, they're getting grumpy and dismissing it. It's asking why. Why would they be grumpy, or why would they be starting to be more argumentative? Why would they be particularly quiet? Why do they feel as though they're checked out? Why have we not heard their voice in a while in our conversations, around around the tea room? Those kind of things are where I think we can be at a person-to-person level. That's where other organisations that are organised differently are so at a disadvantage to the watches and the teamwork and the way in which those teams are built in the fire and rescue service. My own institution would be absolutely loving it if we were arranged in more kind of smaller teams than we are. I'm in a department of 172. There's absolutely, we try and cluster ourselves in ways that we can do that, to be kind, to figure out how somebody usually engages in their work, and then actually something feels a bit different. So having those conversations is much more harder because we don't have that same regularity of working together. So there is kind of, you talked about superpowers. There is a little bit of a superpower in the fire and rescue service that we know is really protective. The toxic watch cultures and everything else withstanding, that it should be dealt with and that shouldn't be there. But the nature of that teamwork, the nature of that peer support, and the nature of having the understanding of how each other usually engage in different activities, and then being curious when that changes for somebody. I think those are the kind of things that that are useful. At an organisational level, I think that is around understanding what the resource envelope is, i.e., a fire and rescue service that has a governance structure that's particularly around, might be, kind of part of the county council, for example, versus a big Met with a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more resource in it. It's about understanding what we think that the resource package could be, how it could have the most value for the nature of where that fire and rescue service is, what the strength of the statutory offer, because it is different around the country, and then designing kind of processes, but also a culture that is around we care about one another, we belong to the same organisation, and we're interested in making sure that everybody can flourish here. And how does that culture then translate into being kind to one another and that sense of belonging? Which sounds quite lofty, but actually there's ways to translate that in really quite specific things. So we talk about positive resource ecologies, and those kind of things. So there are ways to do that you can build your policies in that way.
If you're a regular listener to the podcast, then chances are you are big into your own personal development and the development of firefighters around you. So I wanted to remind you of our mobile app Drill Book. This is a free training and development resources made by firefighters for firefighters. Heading on to Drillbook, you will find incident debriefs, radio messages, knots and lines, quick reference guides, quizzes every single day. We've got useful links to the ERG, to Web Rescue, to JESIP, Euro Rescue, 10-second triage, National Operational Guidance, and not to mention our daily quizzes where you will find questions on extrication, casualty handling, breathing apparatus, fire development, water rescue, rope rescue, you name it. It is the go-to resource if you've got a spare 5 minutes on the firehouse to develop yourself and those around you. Not only that, if you're looking to get into the fire service, we've got advice on there on interview questions, interview answers. You can build your own questioning in there. And again, remember, this is built by firefighters for firefighters. So you can add your own drills in there. You can pick the drills that you find the most favorite. There is literally hundreds of training ideas, hundreds of drills in there. Remember, this app is absolutely free and it grows every single day down to the contributions of our thousands and thousands of users. It's freely available on Android, Apple, and you will find it in the links for this podcast. Remember, it's called personal development. The clue's in the name. You've got to work twice as hard on yourself as you do on the job. So always be growing, always be developing. Now let's get back to the show. So I want to be conscious of our time. I want to be respectful for your time. And we're going to put a bunch of links underneath this for people to go and explore those elements a little bit more. I wanted us to take a sharp left turn and talk about the work you do with ASA as well.
Yes, ASA. So Academic Collaboration Evaluation Research Group, which we will just call ASA now because it's just too long to say out loud. So so that's something that we've been. It's just too long, but yeah, ASA. So this is. Something that we've been developing and I've been lucky to be involved in the past 2 years. It's something that the academics that work alongside the Fire and Rescue Service have been trying to get off the ground for about the past 15 years. But it certainly is, it's basically a way to, the way I describe it is to try and dock academic knowledge into the Fire and Rescue Service. So you've got the evidence where you need it in a way that is accessible. Other organisations and sectors have this in different ways, but the Fire and Rescue Service, and for those academics that work alongside them, we've never really had it. We've never really got a regular, stable way to take all of the academic work that's done, synthesise that down, and then put that into the places and spaces that you need them within the sector. And so it's something that the National Fire Chiefs Council has been developing. I'm lucky enough to be the chair of that. And I think we've had a real journey. People say that in a really non-sentimental way, but it genuinely is. It's had twists, it's had turns. It's because it's slightly more of a challenge in that if we think about, just even if we cluster by blue lights, for example, we take health. They've got their own research funding. They've got their own kind of allied health disciplines. When we think about the disciplines in an academic sense or research sense that would face that sector, they're clustered very nicely as allied health professions. They have their funding streams that they can go off. They can talk to that sector and go, what do you need? What do you need from us, from academics? What are your biggest problems? How can we help you solve them? They can get that funding. When we talk about kind of policing, they've got mostly criminologists that face it. We talk about the Fire and Rescue Service. You've got built environment, you've got maths, you've got physics, you've got engineering, you've got chemistry, you've got psychology, you've got biology, you've got physiology. There is toxicology. There's such a plethora because the and rescue bucket is so big and varied that we ended up with a much wider need for the disciplines to be present on ASA. So ASA is kind of a way in which those disciplines can be represented by different academic figureheads, for want of a better word, but then it's not an exclusive club. Our academics around ASA, their job is to reach back into their disciplines, look at what's going on, and then say to ASA, I think the Fire and Rescue Service probably needs to be aware of this stuff that's going on over here. Then what we then do is try and we're just at the stage now where we're kind of building all the infrastructure to do this. We package it in a way that will fit with the national operational learning and organisational learning processes so that we can get that knowledge into the kind of knowledge system of the NFCC and then out to those different fire and rescue services. So it's not kind of a lofty academics, putting in their own work. And it's not academics that are trying to say, well, I think that, this should happen completely, irregardless of the cost. There's some shaping processes that go on through that. And actually, that might be great. You might think that's how it works. But actually, what the Fire and Rescue Services need it to be like this rather than like that. Then all of that stuff happens. Because what we ultimately want to have is, you did a lovely kind of sentiment earlier on in this discussion around how, you're interested in the academics coming on and sharing their knowledge with your listeners. And it's a way that we can do that. It's just another mechanism to do that. And so, ACE has been a lovely journey to be on. I've learned so much from the other academics, because one of the biggest challenges, I think, in academia is, a PhD, and getting that PhD qualification. And I can say it because I have one, hopefully other people won't be offended. But you kind of know like a mile's depth worth of knowledge about something this wide. So actually piecing that all together and working with those other different disciplines, we all learn from each other all the time, and not in a Pollyanna way. There are some real differences that we're kind of nutting out. But there's also masses of scope. So we're just writing we've written a research strategy for the sector so that we can get that kind of more buy-in from our side of the deal, the kind of academic and research deal. Mm-hmm. What we want to do is go, okay, so research funders, PhD studentships, all our kind of resources that we can draw upon. How can we focus and brigade those around fire? Because at the moment they don't face fire at all. So we've done the research strategy. The next stage is the areas of research interest.
With it, isn't there?
There are, but it tends
to be. It's difficult for them to know how to plug into it, and they're doing it in isolation, and they're plugging in with one particular service, and it's not their intention is fantastic, but it's because, as you rightly articulate, they don't have the infrastructure to be able to say, I have an academic interest in this. And also, like you said earlier, they're conditioned to writing papers. They're conditioned to writing something to arrive at a utopia so that it will be accepted into some sort of academic, whatever they're going to put it on I don't know the words, you know what I mean? They put it on some sort of research development thing, but the utopia answer is not going to be deployable. It's not going to be useful. Sometimes academics write papers for other academics.
I would go so far as to say until recently, our entire structure of our sector and our KPIs were to tell other academics. That's how we were measured in peer-reviewed journals. Yeah. So have we told other academics about our work? Never mind the people who actually might use it. So we had a bit of a sector change about, it's nuts, right? About 10 years ago, we have this big research excellence framework exercise that if you think of kind of like almost like an HMI, but we all get inspected on kind of research and what that research might mean. Up until the last one, how our research was used outside of an academic argument or outside of academia wasn't part of that inspectorate methodology. It was just nuts. Anyway, so we've seen that actually somebody outside of other academics might be interested in what we have to say. And so now that ACER group is really trying to understand what does the Fire and Rescue Service need? What does it need into the future? How can we be something that helps and supports that? And in what ways does that need to be available? And that might change and flex. So some of it might be, a submission into NOL. Some of it might be, at the moment we're exploring, can we do some of the lunch and learns so that we can get some of those kind of leaders in their field in conversation with some of the practitioners. To say, okay, well, that might be great theoretically, but actually it just doesn't bear out in real life. So these are the challenges that we need you to start doing. So those conversations can be much more accessible, and people can start seeing the possibility that ACER can bring.
Well, look, the door is perpetually open for ACER to come on, and all of your colleagues to come and share their learnings. Because with respect, and of course I would say this from my own internal bias, even when people do engage with the service in a lunch and learn, I go, that was really valuable for the 30 people that were there. Is it recorded and nationally distributed and free? Because also some people will go, oh, Rowena, one of your colleagues did a great piece of work with London or Scotland or Derbyshire or wherever. We'd like you to do one with us. And yes, the additional data will be useful, but inside you're also thinking, why can't you just do it together? Why am I going to two different organizations to do this thing? You're both part of the same thing. What are you doing? This is not efficient.
Yeah.
So, I mean, once you guys and girls have taken some of those learnings, I'd love to have any of you back on to discuss some of the findings. And even if we haven't reached that element of utopia, it's always a nice call out for people to engage, because we can go, we've put it on Knoll, or we've put it on the NFC, so we've put it on wherever. And I'm like, okay, so some of the leaders have read it. Who else? Who else has read it? No, not no one, but like, we're not getting the reach that we hope. And like you say, you've almost got to be, and maybe that's been the case today, you've got to get to the point where you're bored of saying it. And then eventually enough people might have heard it or seen it. And you've got to give it to, when we talk about neurodiversity, you've got to give it to people in a way that they're going to be able to digest it as well. A lot of people are not going to sit and read something if it's longer than 1 page long. No. But they might listen to this in the car or wherever. So I really do appreciate you coming on and listening to my stupid questions and all that elements. I wanted to, before we close, just ask you, and I know it's probably a difficult thing to talk about in brevity, but we did have an element of our conversation around civil contingencies, and just trying to probably reach out in the wider first responder community and talk about the uniqueness of the fire and rescue service in that capacity. Yeah, thank you. So this is something that I can't talk enough about, unfortunately, for you this morning. I think so. A lot of my work is around kind of civil contingency. So at a local level, maybe some of your listeners have been part of local resilience forums, or, if a major incident has been declared, they'll have heard of kind of gold, silver, bronze, they would have heard about those anyways, but they might have been on strategic recovery, coordinating groups, or recovery groups, whatever that may be. One piece of my kind of work portfolio that I love is that Cinderella policy, and we call it Cinderella policy because it pops up when we most need it, and then it kind of goes away, and everybody outside of the people that are interested in that and know that it needs to be, kind of forget that it's there. But actually, the health of that mechanism is really dependent on the success of how we manage those really complicated incidents. So a lot of the work that I do is around how does that all work together. And I think part of the way in which not only the last government, the current government, but certainly where a lot of those findings from certainly the Grenfell Tower 5 Public Inquiry Phase 2 report, the COVID-19 Module 1 report, a lot of those different public accountable mechanisms are identifying what is going well, but also by public inquiries, but their very definition is what lessons do we have to learn from that. Manchester Arena bombing is another notable one for people. Probably. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the ways in which that's starting to change things is around, so the resilience framework was launched a couple of years ago, and the element of that with the whole of society approach. So it's not just down to our public services to respond and manage to those incidents and prepare for them, but actually every facet of society should be engaged in understanding what our risks are, and how they can play a part in that. An absolute kind of classic for me is climate change. Not everywhere in the UK will have the same risk profile from our changes in our climate and the impacts that may bring. But understanding and talking through and connecting with communities about what they might be at risk for, and how they can start to think through and have some form of plan involved around what might happen if something happens. Those are the kind of conversations that people are saying that we need to be having. One of the things that I will say until I'm blue in the face is the fire and rescue service are already there. The fire and rescue service are already having the conversations with their communities. Not only one of the most trusted public services, demonstrably, but also it's part of how the fire and rescue service does its work. That prevention work is so important, and by the very definition, it means that you are connecting with different facets of your community, with the private sector, with other sections, critical national infrastructure, with your different community leaders. Those conversations are already happening. So part of my frustration with the fire and rescue service is that you don't talk about what you do outside of your sector enough,
that the public would understand what you did, other than anything to do with engines and fire and water. But also that also is about influencing upwards and outwards. Getting a really confident pitch that actually you're already doing this, and that there's ways in which we could learn from what you're doing and how you're doing it as a sector, and then expand that into that civil contingency space. Because the conversation, certainly at national level, that I'm involved in around how to try and start that work, it's like, well, they've already been doing it for past 20 years since the Bain report. So why are we not starting from scratch? It's got like 20 years worth of relationship building. So I think trying to encourage the Fire and Rescue Service to be proud about that, and trying to encourage the Fire and Rescue Service to share learning about that, I think is something that I would really love to see. Because it's something that I'm so proud of the sector for doing. And I think it's there's so many different ways in which that's been successful, so many different ways in which, people have had to tweak things, that it will stop us falling down those different potholes as we're trying to do that in a broader sense in that local resilience forum partnership space. So that's some of my plea to any of your listeners.
No, it is often when someone, certainly such as yourself, I imagine sometimes you see some of these disasters, and Peter Apps, in a different lens, in a different framework, spoke about, no, this was 100% predictable. You know, and again, I'm talking about that through a very specific lens of infrastructure and other things. But when you do see disasters or acts of malice or terrorist acts, some of the things that you thought would happen, like, when it took them ages to get water to whatever it was in America, when they had the Hurricane Katrina, it took them weeks to get water to the dome and all this sort of stuff. I'd love to have a full conversation around civil contingencies, the Civil Contingencies Act, the National Resiliency Framework. We need to get so really in depth, and that person may be you, I don't know, but I'm sure yourself and other people you're connected with, such a valuable conversation, because there's also a big element around zero responders, and I might be getting my terminology wrong there, but empowering the public, as we're alluding to there, about steps to do. And we sort of see this in a very simplistic, and forgive my very simplistic mindset, but just to keep the listener with us, in elements of, giving them the right knowledge during flooding, giving them the right knowledge during power outages, or even in the most simplistic sense, we have flotation devices at local waterways. We're now seeing, there's defibs everywhere. We're now seeing catastrophic bleed sets go into some lock boxes in old telephone boxes and stuff like that. And I'm doing a very poor job of trying to connect the dots from the right ground level of empowering the public all the way through those levels of first responders, local resilience forums, national frameworks, all of that element. I think the more seamless we can make those connections, so that when these larger regional and national catastrophes do happen, we're not dropping the ball. When I hand it left, Rowena is expecting it, because it always goes left, and she's not going to drop the ball. And the people that pay the cost ultimately are the public, or our environment, or the next generation, which is often really sad. Thank you so much for our conversation today. It's been absolutely insightful for me. I know you're a very, very busy lady. You sit on a lot of boards and you're involved in a lot of literature. So sitting and entertaining my silly questions for 90 minutes, I don't take it for granted. So I really do appreciate it. And again, that door really is open for anybody, for ASA, that wants to come on and have a conversation in the future. I really welcome them to come in. I always call the podcast Learning Out Loud. I'm always happy to be here and be the knuckle-dragging person with some tertiary knowledge of different elements. But it's really a gift when people are willing to get over themselves and come on. And I always say, if you can explain it to a 7-year-old, then you probably know your field well enough. If you can only use really, really super complicated language, then you maybe don't understand it enough. But you've done a beautiful way of not losing me through our conversation today. So I really thank you for your time and your patience.
No, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been something I've been wanting to do for a while. So yeah. And I know you had another member of ASA on recently, didn't you, Emily?
Yep, we've had Emily on. Anna Steck is coming on in the future.
Yep.
We had, oh god, the ladies' names are gonna fail me. So we had
Nicola
Emily Watkins on recently. Nikki Power.
Yeah.
She came on a little while ago. There's loads. We've got 32 episodes currently recorded, waiting to go out. And I always try and think of a way to deploy them so that they're not always same, but I love it. Absolutely love it.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very, very much for having me.
Thank you so much for your time.
All right, take care.
The Firefighters Podcast was created to recognise, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our driving purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means that we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, then please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you're in the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.